We're thinking a lot about risk today, especially epidemiological or disease risk. Unfortunately, humans are very ill-equipped to think about risk. So the goal of this video is to give you an analogy of risk to money to help you make better decisions about the risk. So how is risk like money? Well, let's start with the money part of it. All of you know, and many of you probably have, a household money budget. Well, we can also think about a household risk budget. What's your risk budget? So what goes into your household money budget? Like, how big is your household money budget? It's essentially, oftentimes, it has to do with your income. How much do you bring in? How many dollars do you bring in? So what goes into your household risk budget? The risk factors that go into that goes into who are you and who do you see? So if you see somebody who's older, over 65, if you're over 65, your risk budget is lower than somebody who's young and healthy. If you have diabetes, your risk budget is lower. If you're overweight, or you see or regularly hang out with somebody who's overweight, your risk budget is lower. So that's your budget. That's how much either money you have to spend or risk you have to spend. So once you know what your budget is, either your money budget or your risk budget, you need to think about, well, how do I go about spending that money or that risk budget? Okay, so you know you can spend the money budget by going to the store and buying, say, groceries or things like that. It's obvious when you spend money, right? When you go to the store, you're also, in these days, when you go to the store, you're spending risk. You're spending out of your risk budget in going to the store. You spend out of your risk budget when you're socializing, either when you're socializing with friends or say when you go to a restaurant. So any socializing you do, you spend out of your risk budget. You know, of course, if you go to the store and you drop a T-bone steak into your cart and then you drop two more T-bone steaks into your cart, that you're going to be spending 3 times as much money out of your household budget. Okay? Well, the same kind of thing applies to your risk budget. If you go and you socialize for 20 minutes and then you extend that for another 20 minutes to 40 minutes, and then you extend that again to an hour, you are spending 3 times as much risk to socialize for the hour than you would if you just spent it for 20 minutes, right? So time is a big factor in your risk budget. How much time you spend doing an activity is a huge factor in your risk budget. Another big factor in your risk budget is the number of people you socialize with. If you're socializing with 1 or 2 people, that's one thing. You start adding people, the amount of risk goes up with every new person from a new household or additional people. So socializing with 3 people is 3 times as risky as socializing with just one person. You've added a lot to your risk. So the two big ways that you spend risk and that you can control your risk is the number of people you socialize with and the number of households they're in and the amount of time you spend with them. Another interesting way that we can extend this analogy between risk and money is cost of living. I think everybody knows living in San Francisco is expensive, and living in Fargo is inexpensive. The same things in San Francisco cost more money than they cost in Fargo, right? We can take that idea and flip it and think about the risk currently of living in San Francisco versus living in Fargo. Right now, as I speak in Thanksgiving 2020, we're looking at how much the prevalence of COVID in both of these places, in San Francisco and in Fargo. How many new cases are both San Francisco and Fargo experiencing? In this case, Fargo is expensive for risk, and San Francisco, currently, relatively speaking, is inexpensive for risk. And in fact, if we looked at San Francisco 2 months ago, at the start of October, living in San Francisco was a bargain compared to anything now, right? Fargo has 143 new cases per 100,000 people per day. San Francisco currently has just 13 new cases per 100,000 people per day, right? So currently, in terms of your COVID risk, living in Fargo is 10 times more risky than living in San Francisco. So the same activity that you do in Fargo is 10 times more risky. You're spending 10 times as much risk living in Fargo as you are living in San Francisco. That is not to say that everything is hunky-dory in San Francisco, but where you live and the prevalence of COVID in your area is essentially a cost of living and determines how expensive or how risky, how much you're spending out of your risk budget to do the same thing. So now that you know that risk is like money, let's think about how you might work a risk budget. Well, what do you do if you've got a tight money budget? What do you do? How do you work a tight money budget? Well, you buy less, you look for bargains, and you save up for big purchases. So let's think, if you've got a tight risk budget, how are you going to spend that, or how are you going to manage that? And remember, your risk budget might be tight, not because you yourself are at risk, but because you're living in a high cost of living area like Fargo, North Dakota, or in this case, in San Francisco with cases going up. So how do you work a tight budget? Well, the two obvious ones that correspond to buying less is you have events, you go to events with fewer people, you socialize with fewer people, and for shorter times. So as much as you can do that, great, right? But you can't always buy less, right? You're also looking for bargains, right? If you're on a tight money budget, you're out there, you're looking for good deals. So what gets you good risk deals? Well, I personally think of masks as like coupons. If I wear a mask, I get to do exactly the same thing I would have done normally, but spending much less out of my risk budget. If I wear a mask myself, maybe it's like 2 times. So I can spend twice as long with somebody if I'm wearing a mask. And if they're wearing a mask and I'm wearing a mask, then I can spend something like 4 times as long with them doing that. So masks provide a great benefit to spending out of your risk budget. Similarly, and this is one of the great bargains, is moving outdoors. If you can move an event outdoors, from indoors to outdoors, you can reduce the cost to your risk budget by 10 or 20 times if you can get out. I also want to use this analogy between risk and money to help us avoid psychological traps. So let's say that you have an awesome uncle who just gave you a bunch of money, and it's enough money to go off and buy a bicycle. And you're like, great, I can get a new bike. Do you then also say, oh, well, since I could afford a new bike, I'm going to go buy 2 more bikes, 1, 2, right? No, you have a certain amount of money that's been gifted to you, and you only go off and you just buy what you can afford with the money that you've been given, right? In the same way, you've been sitting here and living within your own bubble for a while, just you and your family or your household, right? And cases drop and you're like, oh, things have opened up. I can go out and I can either dine outside, dine indoors, I can go dine with friends. Do you then say, oh, I can go dine with friends, so now I'm going to go dine with 2 other pair of friends? No, right? In the same way that you only bought 1 bike, you only want to kind of do a small thing at once. You've only been allowed another little bit into your budget. So don't go overboard. You're spending out of this budget, and spending on, as we know, spending on socializing, spending on longer times, it's more expensive. So don't go below your budget. Just because you have done one thing doesn't mean you now get to kind of replicate that as many times as you want. Just because you've dined inside once doesn't mean, okay, now all dining inside is on the table. That's not how this works. In a similar vein, let's say your kid is now in soccer, right? Does that now mean that you get to go off and do weight training and that you also get to go to the movies just because your kid is in soccer? No. You've got a budget and you need to decide how to spend that budget wisely, right? What's the most important activities to you and your household and your families, and trade it off. Like, does your family want to go and socialize with your friends next door? Or is it more important that your kid goes to soccer lessons, or is weight training? What's important to you and your family, and make those trade-offs for your budget. Let's talk about another psychological trap that can happen. You and a friend, you're at a restaurant, and all of a sudden you start to see coins falling out of your pocket, rolling away down into the sewer grate. Are you just going to sit there and let them roll away and not do anything about it? Or are you going to kind of stop, either take the coins out of your pocket, sew up the hole, are you going to do something about all of this money kind of flowing out of your pocket? In a similar way, let's say you and the friend are sitting outside, sharing a meal, but also sort of socializing. You've agreed to wear masks so that you can spend more time socializing without blowing your budget. And you take your mask off to have a sip or a drink or eat something, and you're so into the conversation that you forget to put the mask on. Okay. When you realize you've forgotten to put the mask on, do you say to yourself either, oh, my mask is off, so I should just leave it off because it was already off? No, it's just sort of like you found this hole in your pocket, just pick it up, put the mask on. Just because you have forgotten to put a mask on in a situation where you've made a mistake risk-wise doesn't mean that now you shouldn't go back and just correct the mistake. Put the mask on. You've spent a little more risk than you intended to, but you can stop the bleeding and stop the excess flow of risk. So I hope in this video I've been able to help you think about your risk budget like you think about your money budget. I'd like for you to think about your risk budget and spend your risk wisely in ways that make you and your family and your household happy. I'd like for you to be able to look for risk bargains to get a great deal on kind of the risk that you are spending, socializing outdoors, socializing with masks, doing whatever you want to with masks, so that you're just spending less risk out there to do the things that you want to do. I'm also hoping that having this money risk analogy helps you understand and not fall into some of the psychological traps that we as humans get into with risk. So just because you start doing one thing doesn't mean you now do a whole bunch of that things, or just because you have taken a little bit of extra risk unexpectedly doesn't mean that you should now not staunch that flow of risk, that spending of risk that you're doing. I've gotten through everything that I wanted to in this video, but now I'm going to give those of you who maybe want to read ahead a little extra bonus, extra credit material to work with. So I'm going to point you to a website called microcovid.org, which is a way of calculating a risk as a budget. And in fact, you can even keep track of it if you wanted to in an Excel spreadsheet. Caveat here, this is very approximate. This is just a very rough guess, but it helps you get into that mindset of risk like a money budget. So let me just point you to 3 areas of this website. So in step 1, where it enters your location, that is like the cost of living. So that in that step, what you're doing is you're adjusting the cost of living for the prevalence of COVID. If you scroll down to the bottom of the screen where it says adjust your risk tolerance, this image here, those are the different budgets that you might have. That's how much risk are you willing to spend? Are you low risk tolerance or high risk tolerance? And then you can do step 2 you can adjust your activity. So you can say, this is what I'm planning to do, and get a sense of how much of my risk budget am I spending on this activity for my location. So go and explore the site on your own if you're interested in it. If it seems overwhelming, I'm going to come up and have another video after this one explaining how to use the site and how to work it. So hope this helped you, and I will talk with you later. Bye.